The vast windswept grasslands of the Black Hills Bison Range in South Dakota were a kingdom of immense, shaggy beasts, a place where the thunder of hooves still echoed the heartbeat of an older, wilder America. It was a sprawling territory of rolling hills, sun-scorched plains, and hidden springs, managed by a team of dedicated conservationists who saw themselves as guardians of a living legacy. Within this kingdom, power was simple and absolute. It belonged to the massive herd bulls, titans of muscle and fury who commanded the best grazing lands, the loyalty of the cows, and the future of the bloodline. And on the furthest, most desolate fringes of the society lived Shadow. He was a magnificent anomaly, a fully grown bull with the size and potential strength to challenge any rival. Yet he was an outcast, a ghost on the edge of the herd. Shadow was blind, born with a congenital. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Defect that had left his world a permanent tapestry of darkness. He had been rejected from the moment of his birth. His mother, guided by the brutal pragmatism of nature, had nudged him away, knowing a blind calf was a liability, an easy target for the wolves and coyotes that haunted the plains. He had survived through a combination of sheer luck and the development of senses so preternaturally sharp they bordered on the mystical. While the other bison navigated a world of sight, Shadow lived in a world of sound, scent, and vibration. He could feel the distant approach of a truck through the solace of his hooves, smell a hidden spring from a mile away, and map the terrain. In his mind, through the echoes of the wind whistling past a rock outcropping. But this unique perception came at the cost of community. The herd, a complex society built on visual cues, the flick of a tail, the lowering of a head, the subtle body language of dominance and submission, had no place for him. He was a puzzle they couldn't solve, an unnerving presence who didn't respond to their visual language. The other bulls saw him as an irrelevance, pushing him away from the choicest grasses, while the cows warily guided their calves away from the strange, solitary bull who moved with such unnerving, quiet deliberation. He was forgotten, a rounding error in the great census of the herd, left to a lonely existence in a world of perpetual twilight. The only human who saw him as anything more than a biological curiosity was Dr. Iris Thorne. A young, brilliant behavioral ecologist fresh from her doctorate, Iris had joined the range management team 3 months prior. While her colleagues focused on herd genetics and grazing patterns, Iris found herself irresistibly drawn to the story of the blind outcast. She spent hours every day in her dusty observation jeep, parked on a high butte overlooking the Badlands where Shadow spent most of his time. With high-powered binoculars and a sensitive directional microphone, she documented his life, her research notes painting a portrait, not of a defective animal, but of a master survivor. She watched, fascinated, as he navigated a treacherous, rock-strewn gully by listening to the subtle differences in how his own heavy breathing echoed off the canyon walls. She recorded how he could differentiate the footfalls of a predator from those of another bison long before any sighted animal would have noticed. To her, Shadow wasn't a tragedy. He was a marvel of adaptation, a testament to life's ferocious will to endure. He's developed a form of echolocation, she explained excitedly to her boss, a grizzled, no-nonsense range manager named Frank Miller. His other senses have compensated for his lack of sight to a degree that is frankly unprecedented. He's not just surviving out there, Frank. He's thriving in his own way. Frank grunted, his gaze fixed on the main herd. He's a genetic dead-end, Iris. He'll never breed. He's a ghost. Let's focus our resources on the viable population. Iris refused to be deterred. She felt a profound connection to the lonely bull, a kinship of one outsider to another. She was a woman in a field dominated by men, a theorist in a world of practical ranchers. In Shadow's stoic solitude, she saw a reflection of her own fight for recognition. She continued her observations, her belief solidifying into a certainty. This blind, rejected, forgotten bison was special. He possessed a kind of intelligence that couldn't be measured by herd status, a quiet strength that was waiting for a purpose. She had no idea that purpose was about to arrive in the form of a silent, invisible plague that would bring the entire kingdom of the sighted to its knees, and that the one they called ghost was about to become the only beacon in a world plunged into chaos. The sickness came on the dry winds of late summer, a silent, insidious invader. It was a neurological bacterium, likely born in the stagnant, drought-shrunken waterholes, and it spread through the herd with terrifying speed. Its first symptom was subtle, a slight unsteadiness, a moment of disorientation. The mighty bulls would shake their massive heads as if to clear a fog, and the cows would stare blankly at their own calves, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. Within days, the disease progressed. The animals' sense of balance deteriorated. They would stumble, their powerful legs turning clumsy and unreliable. Their visual processing became distorted, the familiar landscape transforming into a confusing, threatening funhouse of shifting shapes and deceptive distances. The complex social structure of the herd, built on a foundation of predictable visual communication, shattered. A bull would misinterpret a rival's stumble as a challenge and launch into a confused, staggering charge. A mother would fail to recognize her own calf's signal of distress. Panic, a contagion more virulent than the bacterium itself, began to ripple through the herd. They became a disoriented mob, their movements erratic and dangerous. Frank Miller and his team of rangers were in a state of controlled panic. They had sent samples to the state veterinary lab, but a diagnosis was days away. In the meantime, they could only watch as their magnificent, thriving herd descended into chaos. The only island of calm in this sea of confusion was Shadow. From her observation post, Reese watched with a pounding heart as the blind bull remained utterly unperturbed. The visual chaos that was driving the others mad meant nothing to him. His world was one of sound and vibration, and that world remained constant and reliable. In fact, his unique senses gave him an incredible advantage. He could hear the faltering, unsteady heartbeat of a sick animal from yards away. He could feel the erratic, panicked vibrations of the herd's movement through the ground and knew to stay clear. While the sighted were being betrayed by their primary sense, Shadow's reality remained pure and unfiltered. The crisis escalated on the third day. A small group of about a dozen calves, born that spring, had been separated from their now unreliable mothers during a panic stampede. They had been driven into a treacherous area of the range known as the Sinking Bog, a network of deep, muddy wallows and thick, thorny brush. The calves were trapped, their small legs sinking into the sticky mud, their cries of distress thin and desperate against the vast, indifferent sky. The rest of the herd, lost in their own neurological storm, paid them no mind. But Shadow heard them. From his solitary grazing spot 2 miles away, his sensitive ears picked up the high-pitched sounds of their fear. For his entire life, these sounds had been a part of a world that had excluded him. But this time was different. The cries were not just a signal of another's trouble. They were a call that resonated with the deepest, most suppressed instinct. In his soul, the instinct to protect the vulnerable. Reese, tracking him with her microphone, heard the shift. Shadow's steady, rhythmic breathing changed. He lifted his head, turning it slowly from side to side, pinpointing the source of the cries with uncanny accuracy. Then, to her astonishment, he began to move. He didn't run. He moved with the same deliberate, purposeful gait he always used, but his direction was unwavering. He was heading straight for the sinking bog. He was heading straight for the crying calves. The forgotten outcast, the blind ghost of the plains, was walking toward a danger that had terrified and defeated the rest of his kind. He was answering a call that no one else could hear, on his way to perform an act that would shatter his lonely existence and transform him into the stuff of legend. The journey to the sinking bog was a masterclass in sensory navigation. Maurice followed in her jeep at a respectful distance, her camera recording every moment, her scientific mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. The main herd was a chaotic mess, a living obstacle course of staggering, unpredictable animals. Shadow moved through them like a phantom. He didn't see them, so he was not confused by their erratic behavior. He felt their vibrations in the ground. He heard their strained, panicked breathing, and he plotted a course around them with the precision of a river flowing around stones. He was an island of purpose in an ocean of pandemonium. When he reached the edge of the bog, the air was thick with the scent of stagnant water and the sound of the calves' weakening cries. The terrain here was a nightmare, even for a sighted animal. Patches of solid-looking ground were actually thin crusts over deep, sucking mud, and dense thickets of thorned bushes created impenetrable walls. For a blind animal, it should have been impossible. Maurice watched, her hand over her mouth, expecting him to falter, to become trapped himself. But Shadow was in his element. He stopped at the edge of the treacherous ground and became utterly still, his massive head lowered. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with his entire body. He was reading the landscape through sound. He let out a low, deep rumble, a sound that was almost too low for Maurice to hear. The sound wave traveled out, and he tilted his head, listening to the echoes as they returned. A patch of mud would absorb the sound, while solid ground would reflect it back differently. He was painting a map of the terrain in his mind, a detailed, three-dimensional image built of echoes. He took a step, testing the ground, then another. He was slow, but his path was unerring. He was avoiding the deep mud and finding the narrow, hidden trails of solid earth with an accuracy that seemed magical. He found the calves huddled together on a small muddy island in the center of a particularly nasty stretch of bog. They were exhausted, terrified, and coated in mud. A pair of opportunistic coyotes were circling the perimeter, their yellow eyes glowing with hunger, kept at bay only by the thorny brush surrounding the small patch of land. The calves fell silent as shadows. Massive form emerged from the brush. They had only ever known him as the strange, solitary bull to be avoided. But now, his presence was not threatening. It was immense, solid, and calm. The coyotes, sensing the arrival of a 2,000-pound protector, vanished back into the landscape with disappointed yips. Shadow stood before the calves for a long moment, assessing the situation with senses that saw more than eyes ever could. He could smell their fear, hear the frantic, shallow rhythm of their breathing. He knew they were too weak and frightened to find their way out on their own. He needed to lead them. But how could a blind bull lead a dozen terrified calves? He couldn't nudge them from behind or guide them with visual cues. He had to invent a new way to shepherd. He turned, facing the direction from which he had come, and let out that same low, resonant rumble. Then he took a few steps and stopped, waiting. The calves were hesitant. They didn't understand. He rumbled again, a steady, rhythmic sound. Like a deep drumbeat. Follow this sound. This sound is safety. One of the bolder calves, a small heifer, took a tentative step, then another, moving toward the source of the reassuring vibration. The others, seeing her movement, began to follow. The procession began. It was the most extraordinary sight Maurice had ever witnessed. A blind bull, leading a dozen calves through a treacherous bog, using nothing but a language of sound he had invented in the moment. His pace was agonizingly slow. He would move a few feet, stop, rumble to gather his small flock, and then listen, mapping the next few feet of safe passage before proceeding. It was a painstaking, mentally exhausting process. Any miscalculation could be disastrous. At one point, a calf slipped from the path and its leg plunged deep into the sticky mud. The small animal let out a piercing cry of terror. Shadow stopped the entire procession instantly. He turned, pinpointing the calf's location with perfect accuracy. He walked to its side and used his massive head to gently, patiently nudge and push the calf's hindquarters, providing leverage and a solid surface to push against until the small animal could pull its leg free. He then guided it back to the group before continuing. The entire rescue, a journey of no more than 300 yards, took over 2 hours. As they finally emerged from the bog onto solid ground, Aris could see the exhaustion in Shadow's posture. He had expended enormous physical and mental energy, but he wasn't done. The calves were safe from the bog, but they were still lost. He rumbled them together and began the long, slow journey back toward the main valley, where he could smell the familiar scents of the corrals and hear the distant sounds of the rangers' activity. As his strange procession crested the final hill overlooking the valley, the entire range management team saw him. They stood in stunned silence, their work with the sick herd forgotten for a moment. There was Shadow, the blind reject, the forgotten ghost, walking with a calm, regal dignity. And behind him, following his every step, was the future of the herd, a dozen mud-caked, exhausted, but living calves. The other bison, even in their diseased confusion, seemed to sense the significance of the moment. They parted before him, clearing a path. The outcast was walking through the heart of the herd for the first time in his life, and he was not being shunned, he was being revered. He led the calves directly to the makeshift triage area the vets had established, stopping a safe distance away as if to formally hand them over. Then, his duty done, he turned and began to walk silently back toward his solitary patch of the plains. But something had irrevocably changed. A legend had just been born in the dust and chaos, and the life of the blind bison would never be the Yuefi same again. The impact of Shadow's heroic act rippled through the sanctuary and beyond. The dozen calves he had rescued became the cornerstone of the herd's recovery. With the disease finally identified and a treatment protocol in place, the veterinary teams were able to save most of the adult population, but it was the survival of the next generation, secured solely by Shadow, that guaranteed the long-term future of the Black Hills herd. The change in the herd's behavior toward him was immediate and profound. It was as if their collective consciousness had been fundamentally altered. The bull who had been an untouchable outcast was now treated with a deference that bordered on reverence. When he approached a waterhole, the other bison would part, giving him first access. When he moved across the plains, a space would clear around him, not out of fear, but out of a deep, instinctual respect. The most touching transformation was seen in the cows whose calves he had saved. These mothers, now recovered, began to approach him. In a gesture that brought tears to Aris Thorne's eyes, one of the mothers walked up to Shadow as he stood resting in the sun and began to gently groom his thick, matted flank with her tongue. It was the first act of social acceptance, of tender, communal contact that he had ever known in his entire life. He stood perfectly still, his stoic composure for once betraying the deep seismic shift occurring within him. He was no longer alone. He was a part of the whole. Aris Thorne's. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Footage of the rescue, combined with her years of meticulous research notes, became the basis for a landmark paper. Published in the world's most prestigious ecological journal, her work, titled Compensatory Sensory Navigation and Emergent Altruism in a Visually Impaired Bison, sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It provided irrefutable evidence of cognitive abilities in bison complex problem-solving, abstract communication, and selfless altruism that had previously been considered the exclusive domain of primates and cetaceans. Shadow's story challenged the very definition of animal intelligence. Aris became a celebrated figure in her field, but she always deflected the praise, making it clear who the real star was. "I was just the narrator," she would say in interviews. "Shadow wrote the story. He showed us that what we perceive as a disability can, under the right circumstances, become a unique and powerful strength. He taught us that the measure of a being isn't found in its perfection, but in its resilience." Frank Miller, the gruff range manager, was a changed man. He had once dismissed Shadow as a genetic dead end, but he now spoke of him with the awe usually reserved for natural wonders. He personally oversaw the construction of a new supplementary feeding station in Shadow's preferred territory, ensuring the aging hero would want for nothing for the rest of his days. The legend of Shadow, the blind shepherd, became a permanent part of the region's folklore. Tourists visiting the Black Hills would ask to be shown the miracle bog and would listen, rapt, as rangers recounted the tale. He became a symbol of hope, a testament to the idea that even the most forgotten and rejected among us possess an inner greatness, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. For Shadow, the fame and the legend were meaningless. What mattered was the quiet reality of his new life. He no longer kept to the desolate fringes of the range. He now moved with the herd, a respected, integral part of the community that had once shunned him. The calves he had rescued were his constant companions. They had imprinted on him in a way, and they trailed him like a small, devoted honor guard, their presence a constant, comforting reassurance. They would graze near him, lie down to rest when he rested, and their mothers seemed to welcome the arrangement, understanding that their young were in the presence of the greatest protector on the plains. Aris continued to study him, but her work was now less about data and more about bearing witness. She would often just sit in her jeep and watch as Shadow stood peacefully in the heart of the herd, the setting sun casting his massive silhouette in long, heroic lines across the grass. She would watch as other bison, bulls, and cows alike would approach him with quiet respect. They had finally learned his language, not the language of sight, but the language of presence, of strength, of a spirit that had overcome impossible odds. One cool evening, as the first stars began to prick the deep purple of the twilight sky, Aris watched a scene that perfectly encapsulated the entirety of his journey. Shadow was standing near a spring, and the young heifer who had been the first to follow him out of the bog approached him. She gently nudged his side, a clear invitation. For a moment he remained still, as if unused to such familiarity. Then, slowly, he leaned into her touch, a barely perceptible gesture of acceptance. Another calf joined, then another, until the blind bull was surrounded, a dark, immovable island of peace in a sea of gentle, loving creatures. He had been rejected, forgotten, and left to a life of solitary darkness. But through one extraordinary act of courage and compassion, born from his own perceived weakness, he had saved them all. And in saving them, he had finally, truly, come home. His blindness had not been a curse, but a lens. It had allowed him to see the world not for what it looked like, but for what it was, a network of connections, vibrations, and sounds. It had allowed him to hear the cries of the helpless when all others were deafened by their own panic. The forgotten ghost had become the herd's guiding light, a living legend whose story would be whispered on the Dakota winds for generations to come, a timeless reminder that true vision has nothing to do with sight. The peace that followed the crisis was deep and abiding. For 7 years, the legend of Shadow was the bedrock upon which the life of the herd and the reputation of the sanctuary were built. He was no longer a ghost. He was a monument. The calves he had rescued, now fully grown and powerful in their own right, formed the core of a new generation that treated him with a unique reverence. They were his Praetorian Guard, a living, breathing shield of loyalty that moved with him, grazed with him, and rested with him. At the head of this guard was Storm, a young bull whose magnificent frame and explosive energy were a perfect embodiment of his name. He was the strongest, the boldest, the most charismatic of the rescued calves, and his devotion to Shadow was absolute. He saw the old blind bull not as a fragile relic to be pitied, but as a king to be protected. Where Shadow went, Storm was. Never more than a few feet away, his sharp, sighted eyes serving as a vigilant perimeter for the master whose world was composed of sound and scent. Arise Thorne, now the director of the Black Hills Range, had seen her own career flourish on the back of Shadow's story. Her research had opened up new avenues of thought in animal cognition, but she remained, at her core, the humble observer, the dedicated narrator of his life. She watched as Shadow, now entering his twilight years, carried the mantle of his legend with a quiet, unassuming grace. He was the herd's moral center, his calm presence a constant balm against the small anxieties and rivalries of their daily lives. The story felt complete, a perfect circle of redemption and acceptance. But the wilderness is a relentless storyteller, and it had one final brutal chapter to write, a test that would determine whether a legend, once forged, could endure, or whether its lessons had to be relearned in the crucible of a new and terrible trial. The warnings began in the late autumn, carried on the whispers of meteorologists and the anxious chatter of the old-timers in the nearby towns. The jet stream was behaving erratically, a super El Niño was brewing in the Pacific, and the models were all predicting a winter of unprecedented ferocity. They called it a once-in-a-century event, a phrase that made the hair on Arisa's neck stand up. She and her team began their preparations, stockpiling massive amounts of feed, reinforcing shelters, and mapping out emergency protocols. The bison, too, sensed the coming change. They grew thicker coats, foraged with a new urgency, and a restless energy began to hum through the herd. The coming winter was a living thing, a predator stalking them from beyond the horizon. The central conflict arose from a question of survival strategy. Bison herds in this region had survived harsh winters for millennia by moving to a place called Cottonwood Valley, a low-lying, sheltered canyon with a spring-fed creek that rarely froze solid and groves of trees that provided a natural windbreak. It was the ancestral wintering ground, its location a map imprinted on their collective DNA. Storm, now in his prime and the de facto leader of the herd's day-to-day movements, began to instinctively push the herd south towards the familiar safety of the valley. His logic was sound, his actions driven by a fierce protective instinct. He saw the coming storm and sought the shelter his ancestors had always used. His strength and certainty were a powerful magnet, and the younger half of the herd, the strong, the confident, the sighted, followed him without question. But Shadow was not following. The old blind bull grew increasingly agitated as the days grew shorter and colder. His heightened senses were feeding him a different story, a terrifying narrative that contradicted 1,000 years of instinct. He could feel the minute, almost imperceptible drop in barometric pressure that signaled a storm of impossible weight and density. He could smell a strange, brittle quality in the air, a scent of deep, petrifying cold that he had never encountered before. Most unnervingly, when he stood facing the direction of Cottonwood Valley, the sound of the wind had a different character. To the others, it was just wind. To him, it was a complex acoustic signal. He could hear how it was being funneled, how the unique geography of the valley would turn a strong wind into a deadly focused torrent of frozen air. He could also hear, in a way no one else could, the immense, groaning weight of the early snowpack on the high peaks that formed the valley's rim. His entire being screamed that Cottonwood Valley was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. He began to resist Storm's push. He started moving in the opposite direction, north, towards the seemingly barren and exposed expanse of the high granite plateau. To the other bison, it was an act of madness. The plateau was a windswept, desolate place with little vegetation and no obvious shelter. Storm, in his love for his old mentor, saw it as a sign of senility. He believed Shadow's age and blindness were finally betraying him, leading him astray. The young bull's protective instincts went into overdrive. He began to actively block Shadow's path, using his powerful body to gently but firmly nudge, and turn the old bull back towards the south, back towards what he was certain was safety. "He's trying to guide him," Aris said, watching the tense drama unfold from her jeep, her heart aching. "He thinks Shadow is lost, but what he doesn't understand is that Shadow sees more than he does." The herd fractured. The younger bison followed Storm, their faith placed in his strength and the evidence of their own eyes. But the older animals, especially the mothers of the calves Shadow had rescued years ago, hesitated. They remembered the last time the herd had faced a crisis. They remembered the blind bull's impossible wisdom. They began to follow Shadow, a smaller, older, slower contingent moving toward the desolate plateau, away from the perceived safety of the valley. The herd was split in two, following two leaders, one guided by the wisdom of sight and tradition, the other by the invisible arcane knowledge of the senses. The blizzard struck with the force of an artillery barrage. It was not a storm. It was a physical assault, a roaring wall of white that erased the world. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, with a wind chill that was almost instantly lethal. Visibility dropped to less than a foot. The universe was reduced to a screaming, frozen chaos. Sight, the sense that had governed this world for eons, was now utterly useless. Every animal was now as blind as Shadow. In Cottonwood Valley, the situation turned catastrophic within hours. As Shadow's senses had predicted, the canyon walls acted as a massive funnel, concentrating the wind into a jet stream of ice crystal-laden air that scoured the flesh and stole the breath. The bison that had followed Storm huddled together for warmth, but there was no escaping the ferocity of the wind. Worse, the sheer weight of the snow being dumped on the peaks above reached a critical point. A low, deep rumble, far more powerful than any bison's call, shook the very foundations of the earth. The avalanche began. It was a tidal wave of snow, rock, and ice, thundering down the mountainside directly into the mouth of the valley. Panic, absolute and primal, seized Storm's followers. Trapped in the narrow canyon, blinded by the blizzard, they had nowhere to run. Storm, their strong-sighted leader, was as lost as the weakest calf. His strength was meaningless, his vision a cruel joke. He could only roar his helpless fury into the white void as the sound of their doom grew louder. Miles away, on the high plateau, Shadow's small band of followers was also struggling against the storm's fury. But here the wind, while brutal, was diffuse, unable to focus its deadly power, and Shadow was in his element. The roaring whiteness that terrified the others was his normal state of being. He was not disoriented, he was calm. He led his followers with unerring certainty, navigating by the feel of the granite under his hooves and the way the wind broke against unseen formations. He was leading them towards a memory, a sensory map he had built over years of solitary wandering. He led them to a featureless rock wall that, to any eye, looked like a dead end. But Shadow knew better. He had smelled the faintest trace of warmer air seeping from it, had felt the way the ground vibrated differently here. He pushed against a section of the rock that was in fact a massive, ancient rockfall that concealed the entrance to a network of deep, interconnected limestone caves. It was a geological secret, a natural fortress that no one, not even the rangers, knew existed. He guided his small, trusting herd into the relative warmth and absolute safety of the caves, just as the avalanche obliterated the entrance to Cottonwood Valley, burying it and all who remained within under 50 feet of snow and ice. The storm raged for 3 days. Inside the hidden caves, Shadow and his followers survived. The space was vast, sheltered from the wind, and the geothermal heat radiating from the deep rock kept the temperature just above freezing. They were safe. When the blizzard finally broke and a brilliant cold sun emerged, the world was a transformed, silent wilderness of white. Reese and her team, who had been hunkered down in the main compound, immediately launched a search and rescue operation, fearing the worst. Their snowcats reached the buried entrance of Cottonwood Valley first, and the sight confirmed their fears. There were no survivors. The loss was devastating, nearly half the herd gone in an instant. With heavy hearts, they turned their search towards the northern plateau, expecting to find only the frozen remains of Shadow and his small, misguided band. What they found instead left them speechless. Standing at the entrance of the hidden cave system, silhouetted against the blinding white snow, was Shadow. And around him were the survivors, weary but alive. But they were not alone. Staggering towards them from the edge of the avalanche field were a few dozen more survivors from the valley, a small, traumatized remnant of Storm's once proud contingent. And at their head, his magnificent coat caked with ice, his body bruised, and his proud spirit utterly broken, was Storm himself. He had somehow managed to climb out of the deadly churn of the avalanche, along with a handful of others who had been at the very edge of the slide. They had survived, but they were lost, freezing, and leaderless. Storm saw Shadow, saw the survivors around him, saw the impossible shelter of the caves, and he finally understood. His sight had led them to their doom. Shadow's blindness had led them to salvation. The young bull, once the epitome of strength and certainty, stumbled forward. He walked directly to Shadow and stopped. Then, in a gesture of profound submission, of ultimate respect, of a paradigm being shattered and rebuilt, he lowered his massive head to the ground before the old, blind bull. He was not just yielding leadership. He was acknowledging a higher wisdom, a form of vision that his own eyes could never possess. Shadow did not react with dominance. He simply stood, a pillar of quiet dignity, and then let out his low, welcoming rumble, the sound that meant safety. Follow me. He led the broken remnants of Storm's followers into the warmth of the caves, reuniting the herd's survivors under his unlikely command. The legend had been reborn. It was no longer a story of a single past act of heroism. It was now a living, breathing truth, understood by every surviving member of the herd. Shadow's wisdom was not a fluke. It was a fundamental, reliable force. Reese, documenting the entire scene, felt tears freezing on her cheeks. She was witnessing the birth of a new culture within the herd, a society that would now forever carry the lesson that true leadership is not always about what is seen, but what is sensed, and that the most rejected soul can hold the key to everyone's survival. In the months of recovery that followed, Storm became Shadow's most devoted apprentice. He never left the old bull's side, but his role had changed. He was no longer a guard, protecting a revered relic. He was a student, learning to pay attention to the world in a new way. He watched how Shadow tested the wind, how he listened to the earth, how he navigated the world with a confidence that had nothing to do with sight. He was learning the language of the blind king. The final years of Shadow's life were his most profound. He was the undisputed patriarch of the herd, his wisdom the final word in all their movements. He had not only saved them, but he had taught them a new way to survive, a new way to be. When he finally laid down for his last rest, years later, he was not on the fringes of the plain. He was in the very heart of the herd, surrounded by 2 generations of bison who owed their lives to him, their warm bodies a final loving shield against the cold. Storm stood vigil over him, his massive head bowed, a silent promise to carry the legend forward. Reese Thorne wrote the final entry in her decades-long journal on Shadow. We thought his story was about a disability that became a strength, she wrote, watching the herd from her familiar post. But it was never about disability. It was always about a different kind of sight. He spent his life in the dark, and in doing so, he learned to see the truth that light often conceals. He was a legend not because he performed one great act, but because he lived a life that proved that the most valuable wisdom is often found in the places we have been taught to overlook, and in the beings we have been taught to forget. The decade following Shadow's passing was one of quiet growth and profound respect at the Black Hills Bison Range. His story, now enshrined in documentaries, books, and the permanent exhibits of the humble visitor center Reese had designed, had transformed the sanctuary into a global symbol of hope. It was a place of pilgrimage for scientists, conservationists, and soul searchers alike. The energy of the place had changed. It was as if Shadow's peaceful spirit had infused the very soil. Storm, his magnificent frame now bearing the full weight of leadership, had matured into a wise and capable patriarch. The lessons he had learned from his blind mentor were evident in his every decision. He was a leader who ruled not through brute force, but through a deep, intuitive understanding of his herd and his environment. He would often lead them to the high plateau, to the hidden caves, not out of necessity, but out of a sense of ritual, of remembrance. He was teaching the new generation the story of their survival, ensuring the wisdom of the blind king was woven into the fabric of their collective being. Reese, her hair now streaked with silver, had become a revered figure in her own right, the steadfast guardian of the legend. She had resisted all calls to turn the sanctuary into a more commercial venture, insisting that its power lay in its authenticity, its raw and untamed spirit. It was, she argued, a living laboratory where the delicate dance between nature and spirit could be observed, not a theme park where it could be packaged and sold. The world, it seemed, had finally learned the lesson. But the world has a short memory, and the forces of progress, with their insatiable appetite for growth, were gathering at the gates. The change arrived in the form of a man named Clayton Rourke. He was the newly appointed regional director for the National Heritage Sites Program, a charismatic and ruthlessly ambitious man who had made his name by turning struggling historical sites into profitable tourist destinations. He was a man who saw landscapes not in terms of ecosystems, but in terms of foot traffic, revenue streams, and branding opportunities. He arrived at Thunder Creek on a brilliant summer day, his polished city shoes a stark intrusion on the dusty ground. He toured the facility with Reese, nodding politely at her quiet explanations, his eyes constantly scanning, calculating, reimagining. In her office, over a cup of coffee he barely touched, he unveiled his grand vision. Reese, what you've maintained here is noble, he began, the word landing with a faint air of condescension. But we're underutilizing its potential. The story of Shadow is a global asset. It has the power to inspire millions, but they can't be inspired if they can't see it. He unrolled a series of sleek, architectural blueprints across her rustic wooden desk. They depicted a future that made her blood run cold. His Vision 2.0 included a massive glass-walled visitor and interpretive center built directly on the butte where Reese had spent years observing Shadow. It featured a fine dining restaurant with panoramic views, paved, multi-lane roads cutting through the delicate grasslands, and a series of elevated, enclosed viewing platforms, skywalks. He called them, that would allow tourists to look down upon the herd like spectators in an arena. We'll honor the legend by making it accessible to everyone, Rourke concluded, his face beaming with the self-satisfaction of a man convinced of his own brilliance. Reese stared at the blueprints, at the sterile lines and cold glass that would be imposed upon this sacred land. He was proposing to build a cage around a miracle. You're not honoring him, Clayton, she said, her voice trembling with a quiet fury. You're packaging him. You're turning his legacy into a commodity. The entire point of his story, the very reason he could do what he did, was because this place was wild. He survived because he was in tune with a natural world, not a curated exhibit. You do this, and you kill the very spirit you claim to be celebrating. Rourke's smile tightened. He had dealt with sentimentalists before, Reese, your passion is admirable, but this site is now under federal purview, and its mandate is to serve the public. The project has already been approved by the board in Washington. This is happening. I'm here to manage the transition, not to debate it. The fight was brutal and demoralizing. Reese exhausted every avenue of appeal. She wrote impassioned articles, called upon her extensive network of influential scientists, and even tried to leverage the media, but Rourke was a master of public relations and political maneuvering. He framed the project as a populist endeavor, a way of bringing an inspirational story to the masses, and painted Reese as an elitist gatekeeper, trying to keep a national treasure for herself. The funding was secured, the permits were fast-tracked, and within 6 months, the first wave of the invasion began. The distant, jarring sound of heavy machinery became the new, unwelcome rhythm of the sanctuary. Surveyors planted fluorescent pink flags across the pristine grasslands, their cheerful color a violent desecration of the natural palette. The scent of diesel fuel and upturned earth began to taint the clean, sage-scented air. The herd was the first to register the deep wrongness of it all. They became skittish, their ancient rhythms disrupted by the alien sounds and smells. Storm, ever vigilant, grew increasingly protective. He led the herd away from the construction zones, pushing them further into the remote northern territories of the range. His movements were agitated, his leadership now tinged with a constant low-grade anxiety. Reese documented it all, presenting Rourke with data showing rising stress hormones in the herd, altered grazing patterns, and a clear avoidance of their traditional grounds. Rourke dismissed it as a temporary adjustment period. "They'll get used to it," he said with a wave of his hand. "Animals are adaptable." Reese knew he was wrong. They weren't adapting. They were retreating. The very soul of the place was shrinking, pulling away from the encroaching noise and sterility of the human world. A year later, the first major phase of Vision 2.0 was complete. A wide black asphalt road, a scar upon the Golden Plains, now led to a colossal viewing platform on the cliffs overlooking Cottonwood Valley. The platform was an angular monstrosity of steel and recycled plastic, an insult to the landscape's gentle curves. Rourke planned a grand unveiling ceremony. He had invited senators, corporate donors, and a swarm of national media. His plan was simple and cynical. The night before the ceremony, he would have his rangers use trucks and bales of hay to subtly lure the herd into the valley, ensuring his guests would have a picture-perfect view of the majestic beasts in their natural habitat. The night before the ceremony, a profound stillness fell over the range. Reese felt it in her bones. It was the same kind of charged silence that had preceded the Great Blizzard. She drove to her old observation post, the one on the opposite side of the range from Rourke's new platform, and watched. As dusk settled, she saw Storm begin to move. He gathered the herd, not with aggressive charges, but with a series of low, meaningful calls. He was not leading them towards the baited trap in the valley. He was leading them north. He moved with a quiet, solemn purpose, his every step infused with the wisdom of his blind mentor. He was leading them on an exodus, away from the encroaching human world, back to the one place that remained pure and untouched, the high granite plateau and the secret sanctuary of Shadow's caves. On the morning of the grand unveiling, Rourke and his esteemed guests gathered on the magnificent new platform. The speeches were made, the ribbons were cut, the champagne was poured. But when the curtains were drawn for the grand reveal, the valley below was utterly, profoundly empty. There was not a single bison in sight. Rourke's face paled, then flushed with fury. He got on his radio, his voice a harsh bark. "Where are they? Find them. I want every ranger, every truck now." The search began, and soon the report came. Back, the herd was located in the inaccessible Northern Territory, near the high plateau. Rourke, in a fit of hubris and desperation, made a fatal error. "Get them back down here," he commanded. "Use the helicopters. Haze them out of there. I want bison in that valley for the evening news." The sound of the helicopter rotors was a violent intrusion, a mechanical dragon roaring through the sacred quiet of the high country. The machine swooped low over the plateau, trying to drive the bison out from the rocky terrain. But Storm was Shadow's apprentice. He knew what to do. He let out a single commanding bellow and led the entire herd. Not into the open, but deeper into the landscape, into the protective labyrinth of the cave system that Shadow had shown them. The helicopter was useless. It could buzz and roar, but it could not reach them. The trucks, trying to follow, found their wide, heavy frames blocked by the narrow, treacherous paths that only a bison could navigate. The wildness of the land itself had become the herd's fortress. The standoff was absolute. The herd, led by a disciple of a blind prophet, had vanished into the earth, refusing to be part of the spectacle. Rourke's event was a catastrophic failure, broadcast live to the world. He stood on his multi-million-dollar platform, a king with no subjects, a ringmaster with an empty circus. It was a Reese who provided the narrative for the world. A news anchor, patched through to her by a producer who knew her history with the sanctuary, asked what was happening. A Reese, her voice calm and clear, her image broadcast from a remote research camera she had installed near the caves years ago, explained. "What you are witnessing is not a failure of management," she said, as the live feed showed Storm standing resolutely at the mouth of the main cave, a dark guardian against the sky. "It is a success of legacy. Clayton Rourke believes you honor a legend by building a monument. But Storm, the successor to Shadow, is showing us the truth. You honor a legend by living its principles." Shadow taught his herd how to find safety in the places no one else could see, how to trust instinct over illusion. Storm is not disobeying. He's honoring his master in the most profound way possible. He is choosing wildness over confinement, sanctuary over spectacle. He has led his people home. Her words were a lightning bolt. The narrative flipped instantly. Rourke was no longer a visionary. He was a fool who had tried to put a leash on a thunderstorm. The public outcry was immense and sustained. The hashtag let them be wild trended higher than hashtag save Kodiak ever had. Within weeks, the project was officially suspended pending review, a bureaucratic euphemism for its death. Rourke was quietly reassigned to a desk job managing historical archives. The asphalt road was eventually torn up, the viewing platform dismantled piece by piece. Nature, patient and persistent, began the slow process of reclaiming its own. Years later, a Reese, now gray-haired and moving with a slow grace of age, stood on the butte where the visitor center was meant to be. The wind whistled through the new growth of prairie grass, and the only marker of the failed project was a single rusting steel bolt half buried in the earth. In the vast distance below, she could see the dark, moving shape of the herd. They were grazing peacefully, led by Storm, his authority now legendary in its own right. Her phone buzzed. It was a young doctoral student from her alma mater, asking for a final quote for her dissertation, a paper on the lasting social impact of the Shadow legend. "What is a legacy?" the student asked. A Reese watched the herd, watched Storm guide a young calf away from a patch of loose rock, and she smiled. "A legacy is not a statue or a building," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of wisdom. "It's a story that gets told until it becomes an instinct. It's the wisdom of the ancestor speaking through the actions of the child. Shadow's legacy isn't here in this visitor center that was never built. It's out there." She pointed her phone towards the herd. "It's in Storm's vigilance. It's in the herd's trust in a leader who knows there are other ways of seeing. It's in the wild, untamable, and sacred silence of this valley. They tried to build a monument to him, But they failed to understand that you cannot build a monument to the wind. You can only honor it by letting it run free. The spirit of the blind bison had not been enshrined in steel and glass. It had been passed on, a living torch of wisdom, ensuring that the lessons learned in darkness would continue to light the way for generations, roaming wild and uncontained across the endless plains. The high plains settled into a long and golden peace. The seasons cycled with a reassuring rhythm, and the legend of Shadow became a truth as solid as the granite foundations of the hills. Arise Thorn, her hair the color of winter snow, moved into the twilight of her own remarkable career, her life's work fulfilled. She had guarded the legend, protected its wild heart, and now, as she prepared for her retirement, she did so with the deep satisfaction of knowing the sanctuary was safe, its future secure. Storm, the powerful bull who had been the legend's first and greatest student, now reigned as the undisputed patriarch of the herd. He was a leader of profound wisdom, his rule a perfect synthesis of strength and sensitivity. He carried the weight of Shadow's legacy not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. The herd was thriving, a vibrant, powerful community whose social structure was uniquely resilient, built on the memory of the two great trials, the plague and the blizzard, that had forged them. They were a living monument to the blind king, who had taught them to see in the dark. It felt, to Arise and to all who knew the story, like the final, perfect, happily ever after. But nature is not a writer of fairy tales. Its cycles are eternal, its challenges relentless. And in the deep, unseen world of microbiology, an ancient enemy was stirring, evolving, preparing to launch a new and terrible assault, an attack aimed not at the herd's bodies, but at the very soul of Shadow's legacy. It began as a whisper of wrongness, a series of small, baffling incidents. A mother cow would become separated from her calf and seem utterly incapable of hearing its distressed cries. Even from a few yards away, a young bull would walk directly into a patch of noxious weeds, his sense of smell, which should have warned him away, completely failing him. Arise, though mostly retired, was called in to consult. Her initial fear was a return of the neurological plague from years ago, but the symptoms were different. The animals weren't losing their balance or visual acuity. They were losing their other senses. Their hearing was fading, their olfactory senses were deadening. They were being wrapped in a shroud of silence and scentlessness. The lab results confirmed her worst fears. It was a mutated strain of the original bacterium, a version that had evolved with a terrifying and almost poetic cruelty. It didn't attack the body. It attacked the very senses that had been Shadow's salvation. It was a plague that created a world of sensory deprivation, turning each animal into a solitary island, unable to hear the warnings of others, unable to smell the approach of danger, unable to communicate through the subtle language of sound and scent that bound their society together. It was the ultimate anti-Shadow plague, an assault designed to dismantle the very foundation of his wisdom. The effect on the herd was catastrophic. The complex social harmony that Storm had cultivated unraveled with terrifying speed. The reassuring rumbles, the warning snorts, the comforting scent of the herd, all of it vanished. They were together, but they were each utterly alone in a silent, odorless world. Panic, a cold and quiet terror, began to set in. For Storm, the experience was a personal hell. The gifts he had inherited from his mentor, the senses he had learned to trust more than his own eyes, were being stolen from him. The world, which had once been a rich symphony of information, was now a muffled, confusing void. He would try to rally the herd, but his commanding bellows would fall on deaf ears. He would try to lead them to safe grazing, but he couldn't smell the difference between sweet grass and poison. His leadership, his entire identity as Shadow's successor, was rendered useless. He was a navigator without a compass, a king whose subjects could no longer hear his decrees. He felt a despair so profound it threatened to crush his powerful spirit. He had failed his mentor. He was failing his herd. He was watching the legend die. Aris watched the slow-motion tragedy unfold, her heart breaking. All her science, all her knowledge was powerless against this. There was no cure, no vaccine. The disease had to run its course. She could provide supportive care, ensure access to food and water, but she could not fix the fundamental brokenness of their world. She couldn't restore their connection to each other. It's like the universe is testing the legend, she confided in Frank Miller, who had come to visit his old friend in her time of distress. It took away Shadow's sight, and he became a hero. Now it has taken away the herd's hearing and smell to see if the lesson stuck. To see if the legacy was just about one animal's unique gift, or if it became something more. The ultimate test came with the full moon. A pack of wolves, larger and more brazen than he's seen in the region for years, had been drawn to the range. Their keen senses told them a story of profound vulnerability. They could smell the sickness, could hear the lack of communication, could see the disorganization. The great, formidable bison herd was no longer a fortress. It was a banquet, waiting to be served. They began to stalk the herd, their dark forms flitting like shadows at the edge of the plains. They tested the perimeter, picking off a few isolated, older animals who had wandered away from the main group, their silent deaths going unnoticed by their sensorily deprived companions. The wolves grew bolder, their hunt tightening into a coordinated siege. They began to press in on the main herd, preparing for a full-scale assault that would result in a massacre. Storm, sensing the tightening circle of predators through the vibrations in the ground, the one sense he had left, was frantic. He charged at the fleeting shapes, but his charges were blind and uncoordinated. He tried to rally the other bulls, but his roars were met with blank confusion. The herd was a scattered, terrified mob, each animal locked in its own silent prison of fear. It was over. The great experiment of Thunder Creek, the beautiful legacy of the blind king, was about to be extinguished by the oldest law of the wild. The weak are meat, and the strong do eat. But in the heart of that despair, something flickered. It was not a command from a leader. It was a memory, an instinct. A story that had been told so many times it had become a part of their very blood. One of the oldest cows, a matriarch who had been among the very first calves Shadow had led from the sinking bog, was the first to act. She couldn't hear the wolves, she couldn't smell them, but she could see the terror in the eyes of the young calf standing beside her. And the memory of what must be done, the core principle of Shadow's entire life, rose up from the depths of her being. The young must be protected. The community is the fortress. She moved to the calf's side, turned her horns outward, and stood her ground. Her action, a single point of certainty in the chaos, was a spark. Another mother, seeing her, did the same, moving to protect her own calf. Then another's. Within minutes, a small tight circle had formed, the mothers of the herd creating a living shield around all the youngest and most vulnerable members. It was a spontaneous, leaderless act of pure, selfless protection. This circle became a magnet. The young bulls, including those who had once followed Storm with such bravado, saw the courage of the cows. They had no leader to follow, but they had an example. They moved to join the defense, forming a second, larger, and more formidable ring around the circle of mothers. Their horns, a wall of sharpened bone, faced the encroaching darkness. They weren't fighting for territory or dominance. They were fighting for the future, for the calves huddled in the center. They were acting as a single cohesive unit, guided not by orders, but by an ingrained cultural ethos. Storm, seeing this miracle unfold, finally understood. His despair washed away, replaced by a profound, humbling realization. Shadow's legacy was not his to carry alone. He was not the sole heir. They all were. His role was not to be the hero who saved them, but to be the heart of the fortress they had built themselves. He moved from the chaotic outer edge to the very center of the concentric circles, standing with the terrified calves. His presence there was a powerful statement. He was not above them. He was with them. He let out a deep, guttural roar, a sound that most of them could not hear, but all of them could feel vibrating through the ground, a defiant assertion of their collective will to survive. The herd had become its own legend. The wolves, faced with this impenetrable multi-layered wall of horns and unwavering purpose, grew confused. Their strategy of picking off the weak was useless. There were no weak. There was only the herd. After several frustrated attempts to breach the living fortress, the wolf pack, pragmatic in their assessment of risk versus reward, melted back into the night. The herd survived. The plague eventually ran its course, leaving behind a population that was smaller but infinitely stronger and more united. They had been tested by the ultimate silence, and they had answered with the resounding voice of community. They had learned to communicate through sight and touch, developing a new social language that was even more intricate than before. They moved together, rested together, and defended together, a single organism animated by a shared memory of protection. Arise Thorne, on the eve of her retirement, wrote the final entry in her long and storied journal. "I thought I understood the legacy," she wrote, her pen scratching across the page. "I believed it was a singular torch of wisdom passed from a master to an apprentice. I was wrong. Shadow's true gift wasn't the skills he taught Storm. It was the principle he taught the herd. The principle that community is the ultimate survival strategy. That the strength of the wolf is the pack, and the strength of the pack is the wolf. He didn't just create a successor. He changed the very culture of his people. He taught them that leadership is not about having all the answers, but about inspiring the community to find the answers together." Her last act as director was to install a new, simple bronze plaque at the base of the stone that marked Shadow's grave. It did not list his accomplishments or recount his heroic deeds. It said only, "He taught us that the thing that saves us is each other." The story of the blind bison had reached its final, most profound truth. A hero's greatest legacy is not to be remembered, but to become so ingrained in the heart of his people that his spirit acts through them long after he is gone. The legend was now complete, not because it was a story about an extraordinary individual, but because it had become the story of an extraordinary herd, forever guided by the selfless love of their blind king. And so, the story comes to its final resting place. The winds that sweep across the plains of the Black Hills today carry more than just the scent of sage and dust. They carry a legend. It is whispered in the rustle of the cottonwood leaves and in the thunder of distant hooves. It is the story of a blind king who was first forgotten, then revered, and finally embodied. For his greatest miracle was not in saving his herd, but in teaching his herd how to save themselves. His true legacy was not a single act of heroism, but a love so profound it became their most sacred instinct. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.